So here we are at HomeGymCon 2023, the inaugural event, the first time ever that there's a specific get-together for home gym owners and the vendors and the athletes that we all want to hear from. My name is Rob from Vintage Weights PGH, and I want to welcome you to Home Gym History. I have some people in the crowd for the very first time. It's 100% okay to clap your hands, everybody. That's an okay response. Like, that's all right. Usually I'm recording in my basement, which sounds creepy, and it's in my home gym, and nobody's clapping. I'm just praying my kids are asleep upstairs and they don't come wandering in. With me here is the one, the only, the all-time world record-breaking in equipped and raw, the innovator, I could go on and on, yeah. Matt Wenning.
Thank you.
Give him a round of applause.
Thanks,
welcome
guys.
him here.
Thanks.
So, Matt, I listed off a couple things about you that we'll certainly get to, and the name of the podcast is Home Gym History. So when I have someone on that's made history, it makes sense to ask you questions about it.
Sure.
But I've gotten curious doing my research. I got my little clipboard here with some other aspects of things, and of course, Westside Barbell. I'm sure many people have asked you questions about it, especially after the documentary came out, Westside versus the World. You probably got inundated.
Yeah, it was interesting, that's for sure.
But before we get up to Westside Point, let's just, go a little further back. So if you don't know, crowd, Matt Wenning, he, as a child, you were hit by a car. And that resulted in spending about a year incapacitated, if you will.
A drunk driver hit me when I was 6 years old on my bicycle in my neighborhood at 50 miles an hour. Got drug under the car. Broke my right leg in 6, my left in 4, and shattered my pelvis. So I was in bedridden for 7 months, wheelchair for about 3, and then, crutches, casts for another 4 to 5 months. So I was homeschooled my entire first grade because I couldn't go to class, couldn't go to school. That was interesting because at that time, that's kind of started the process in a few years of feeling behind. I wanted to play football with my friends in 7th grade. I was in 6th grade.
Captain America was small before he was big.
12, 13, and I was a bigger kid. So the bench press came kind of natural, but my legs were underdeveloped, but became probably my strong point, I would say, by the end of my career. I broke more world records in squatting than I did anything, but the starting from behind started, I just got very lucky. My mom had taken me to a grocery store, and I picked up, I was in the magazine section because I didn't give a shit about the groceries, which I should have at the time, but I didn't know anything. I'm 12. And I pick up this magazine in Muscle and Fitness, and it's talking about pro football guys lifting weights. And I'm thinking, well, shit, if I want to play football, probably ought to start lifting weights. So my mom gets me a membership to the Y, which was only maybe a mile bike ride away from the house.
Nice.
And it just so happened that when I walk into the YMCA, there's a guy named Tim Smith there that was a 500-pound raw bencher at 181.
From Muncie.
From Muncie. And then there's 3 generations. So he was amazing in the mid-late 80s. 10 years prior, his coach, Jim Dawson, was one of the first guys to deadlift over 700 pounds in the Midwest in 1970. He deadlifted 744 at 242. Nobody had pulled 800 yet. So he was one of the best deadlifters in his time. He never got any stronger than that because of families and things of that nature. But the point was they were still active in training. So I come in, they think I'm like a junior in high school. I'm in 6th grade. And so they're like, well, you don't have a fucking choice. You're lifting with us. And I'm like, okay. So Tim calls my mom and is like
automatic coaches.
Yeah, he's got the build. He can be something special if he stays with this. And so Tim kind of leveraged my mom into making sure I was there the whole time. I never really gravitated towards normal team sports after that. I liked me to compete against an innate object where it was all on me. If I failed, it was because I failed. Because in my high schools, we never had teams that were good. So you could be a good player, but you weren't going to win anything because our football program sucked. All the things that I wanted to do, we were terrible at. So powerlifting was easy because I knew if I could shine individually, then it was just on me. And so that's when I started to realize that I was very good at that particular style of mindset to train. So at 13, I entered my first bench press meet. I bench pressed 250. I'm weighing like 170, and I'd already been training for a year. But you got to remember, I'm training with guys that bench press 500 pounds. So
How old were you there?
I was 13.
Before this started, I was talking to you downstairs.
Yeah.
And I was talking about Wenning warm-ups, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
And you said something about like, oh, well, I bench press this, so, that's my Wenning warm-up. I said, well, I'm only bench pressing like 250.
Yeah.
I love that at 13.
It's 13.
At 13, you're
Yeah.
bench pressing 250. Like, let's just
Sounds
internalize
amazing.
that a little bit.
It sounds amazing. And then interestingly enough, less than a few weeks ago, I get this girl that has the unofficial world records right now at 13 years old, shows up from right outside of St. Louis.
Wow.
And she's a 200-pound bencher at 130 body weight at 13 years old. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought I was a freak, So that's how it started. And then when I went and benched the 250, it was cake. And so I go back, and this is important. I talked to Timmy, and I said, Timmy, why didn't I go heavier? He goes, because you're working on technique right now. You're not worried about how much is on the bar. And that stuck with me even as a kid. They never truly let me max until I was already at world-class level. So every meet I would go to, I would get better, but it was easier better. So by the time I was in my early 20s, anything within reason I would put on the bar, I would annihilate, because I never learned to fail. So if at a young age, if you're taking 250 and you're like, boom, and you're like, man, I could have done 275, and the coaches are like, yeah, I know, but you're going to do 275 at a different time. So then 8 months later, I do 290, boom. And then 8 months later, 315, boom. I never learned to like, right?
Grind it
until
out,
I was
yeah.
already super strong. So the first 8 to 10 meets I ever did, I never even really super strained. But what it did is built immense confidence in the competition lifts. Because let's be honest, I mean, even if I'd have broke every world record at 16 years old, in 5 years, nobody would have cared unless you beat all-time world records in the open divisions. And so they knew that I had the potential to do that. Don't waste it in your younger years, which they were absolutely right. So I remember the first lift I strained on, I squatted just a shade under 700 at 19. And that was my first world championships that I had won. So point being is, maximum effort method, although we utilize conjugate system, we never go above 90%. So you go close to failing, but always leaving a little in the tank. And I actually learned that from reading old magazines. Lee Haney, one of the best bodybuilders to ever live, talked about, stimulate, don't annihilate. And that's very important too with any type of strength endeavor that you're doing. Going to a complete failure, you're actually putting the body in a high stress scenario that it's fight or flight, but it's not trying to adapt. So I know it sounds crazy, but the body will adapt to 90% week in and week out. Anything above that, it's going to cause a stressor. And then what will happen is if you're not basically independently wealthy and are single and have no stress, training above 90% will be your mortal enemy.
I don't see a lot of people putting their hands up that fit that category. So
Yeah.
I think that advice will resonate here with this
Yeah,
crowd.
definitely.
Nice. So then somewhere around, I'm guessing 1998, 1999, you graduate from high school.
Yeah.
And then you were a welder for a couple years,
Yeah.
or worked a couple years, and then ended up at Ball State.
My family used to, my dad's side of the family, my Uncle Shorty used to weld all the gas tankers for Marathon.
Uncle Shorty is a great name.
So Shorty owns a huge, and he's not short, he's like 6'4", that's why they call him Shorty. But
Awesome.
he makes all of the big gas tankers you see semis pulling gasoline in, like the aluminum big tankers.
Wow.
He makes those. And so welding was always in my family, which helped start to build my equipment.
Yeah, that's why I bring it up.
With the R&D, but so I'm going into that process. I want to be a pipe fitter. I want to go work in Alaska and weld on the Alaskan pipelines. That's kind of what I want to do. And it just so happened my mom was in charge of surgery in the smaller town that I was from, and she had a lady that worked for her that her son was maybe 5 or 6 years older than me. He was an accountant for the Colts. And he's like, well, if you're doing stuff with weights, you ought to go talk with John Toring. That was the head strength coach at the time. Mind you, John Toring was the head strength coach from 1998 to 2014 for the same team. That's almost unheard of in the pros. So Manning, Edgerrin James, all those dudes.
Everybody.
He, Marshall Falk, he trained all those guys. And I sit down, he's like, oh, where are you from? And I'm like, he's like, and what do you want to do? I said, well, I want your job. So he starts laughing, because I'm like 18. And he goes, where are you from? I said, well, I'm from Indiana. I'm from Muncie. And he goes, oh, yeah, Ball State. And I'm thinking, Ball State, yeah, whatever. Like, it's my home school. I have no clue that it's the #1 college in the country for exercise science and biomechanics.
So,
because
there's some serendipity there.
Yeah, 4 of the 7 founders of the NSCA were my professors.
Wow.
Which was unbelievable. And the reason that they were all there at that time was because we had contracts with NASA. So we were trying to figure out why and how to keep astronauts from losing so much muscle mass in outer space.
Yeah.
And so I was a part of the team to try to figure out what they could do in the shuttle. And so it was, interestingly enough, that was my school. It was 3 blocks away from where I grew up. And so I didn't have to move away to go to school. I could stay at home, save a lot of money. But I had no clue that Ball State had those world-class researchers at that time.
But kind of like the gentleman that took you under their wing at the YMCA.
Yeah.
What a great,
Yeah.
turn of fate that this gentleman points you in the right direction that,
Yeah.
hey, you live.
Yeah, so Touring let me,
Right
they were
at
doing
Ball
upper
State.
body, they were doing upper body stuff at the Colts that day, and Touring was more of a nutritionist and recovery guy, which again becomes a huge factor, especially in the pros. And they're all messing around with 225 because it was somewhere around the combine time. So I lay down at 19 and do 50 reps, which nobody had ever done before. I mean, this guy could kill that. But at 19 years old, nobody even at the Colts had ever even seen that. The NFL combine record was like 46 at the time. And so they're like, what the fuck? Well, so then they asked me if I would come and do some small advising stuff because they're like, dude, you're a freak. And so I'd go in and teach them some bench press stuff. And this didn't last very long because John Touring wanted me to go, and he's like, I want you to go back to Ball State. This was right before I got into school, and you're going to find the head strength coach there for football, and you're going to stick right to him through your entire undergrad. Say, I'm here to work as many hours as you need me in between my classes, and I'll help you any way I can. And that led into being the first undergrad paid assistant strength coach. So he had basically just laid out what I needed to do. But you find that a lot of people, when they want to get in the field, they think, well, if I just get the degree and I get the certs, and that'll be great. It's about connections, right? And it's also about putting yourself out there to where, you're humble enough to go and learn from somebody else. I mean, I could have been a really cocky kid at 19. I had the NFL combine record in the bench. I'd already won a world championship. And now I'm going back to Ball State, and I'm wanting to learn from the head strength coach, right? And so that led into a full ride undergraduate program. I didn't have to pay for any school with my biomechanics, and got to work with some of the brightest minds in the world at that time, Dr. Kwan. So if you guys watch on TV, like the motion analysis, when a guy throws a baseball and you see all the vectors and how much pressure, Dr. Kwan invented that. Whoa. So now he's in charge of Texas Women's Christian University, and all he does is motion analysis. So he was my biomechanics professor, and it just blew my mind because he would be so mad at us because as Americans, he was Korean. We were so far behind in math. He's like, you damn Americans, you don't understand shit about math, He'd be raging. I was like, yeah, but you can't squat anything, so it doesn't really matter, does it?
Yeah, there you go. There's a trade-off. You need us.
He would be mad at me for a minute, and then he would be like, yeah, you're right. I'm a sissy, So so that led into collegiate national records, American records.
Well, it also led, that's a good segue to get into Westside a little bit. That throughout college, I was a part-time member of the military, and that was kind of my other gig. Throughout college, you were part-time at Westside.
So 99, about the same time I go and meet Touring, I actually go, so I'm from Indiana. I'm from a little bit northeast of Indianapolis, and Ed Cohen was 3 hours away in Chicago, and Louis Simmons was 3 hours away in Columbus. And just so happened, remember I said I was in the Colts around February time.
Sure.
March, the Arnold, the first weekend of March is always the Arnold Classic. One of the guys that worked out with us was also working with my mom, Brad Stewart. He was a blood transfusionist. He was like, let's go to the Arnold, man. And I'm like, okay. Now you got to remember back in that day, in 99, you probably remember, the Arnold, if you weren't into pro bodybuilding or pro strongman, you didn't go to the Arnold. So it was a lot smaller and a lot cooler. Now it's baton twirling and all this stuff I don't even recognize as real sports, like jousting. With medieval shit and plastic swords I don't understand. But the point is back then it was hardcore. And I see George Halbert, which ended up being one of my mentors at Westside, bench press 766 at 220, obviously in gear. But back then the shirts weren't that great. I watched him do 635 raw at 220 body weight. So he's a freak. But I see him hit that on this main stage, and Brad Stewart, the guy I went to the Arnold with, was like, you need to go and talk to those dudes, and you need to start driving over there and train them. He's like, you've maxed out the knowledge that you're going to get back home. you need to start traveling and learning from guys.
So we got
that are,
another person pushing you in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, exactly,
You've been
which is
blessed,
crazy, right? So I get the fortitude to walk up to Louie, and you got to remember, Dave Tate's there.
It's intimidating.
Yeah. J.M. Blakely, all the guys that you guys know Westside Barbell as being the hardcore gym, those dudes are all walking together out. And I'm a 19-year-old kid, which is a phenom in its own right, is still very nervous because the homage, even at Westside, even when they put out in those VHS tapes, is like the guys that worked out at Westside were avid drug dealers. They had no life other than lifting, and they were down and dirty people outside of the gym. I mean, this was real. When the original Westside Barbell was initiated, it was from guys in the worst part of Columbus, Ohio that had no future, and Louis made champions. So these guys didn't come from the best families or the best environments. So you're dealing with guys getting, in a discussion.
Not just screaming and yelling intensity in the gym,
Chuck
but like
Vogelpool,
real deal intensity
3-4 years
outside.
before I started lifting there, was playing around with Matt Dimmel, which was the first guy to squat 1,000 pounds from Westside Barbell, and Dimmel was not happy that day, probably on some kind of a drug binge, grabs Chuck and body slams him on the concrete on his head and breaks his neck. Oh. And that's why Chuck's bench never really could get any better from that, and that was playing around at the gym. You leave with a broken neck. And I saw guys get thrown out of there by their throats. I mean, people look at it as idolizing and training there, but you had to be a certain type of person to last in that place. And my adoption into there was Louis brings me in as a teen. I'm fairly strong and I won a world championship, but as a teenager, he didn't care, and he's like, you're going to lift with the big guys today. So I'm lifting with Patterson and these other dudes that are all 700-pound benchers, and we're doing tricep rollbacks on the ground with dumbbells. And we work up to 90-pound dumbbells, and it's out of my range, but I'm there. Like, I got to prove myself. So I blast out like 9 reps with 90s, pausing on the ground and straighten it out, all triceps, beating 2 of the 5 guys in the group. Louis is irate. You don't let a stranger come in here and beat any guy in here. So at that day, he kicked one guy out and let me in.
That was it.
And that I never saw that guy ever again. That's the level of cutthroatness.
Was that the same day? Was it George Halbert that grabbed you by the tricep?
Yeah, we'll get to that. So yeah, it was the same day. I
love that this all happened in one day.
Yeah, why we were doing this in the exercise. I show up, and the main lift that day, they were actually doing a raw tester bench. They weren't going up as heavy as they could go, but obviously, being a kid and you're trying to show off to people you idolize in magazines, I smack an easy 500. Instead of anybody clapping, when you see a 500-pound bench, it's pretty freaky, especially back then as a teenager. People are just looking at me like, whatever. And George Halbert comes up and grabs the back of my arm and goes, you're a decent bencher, but your triceps are garbage. And that was his good job, right? And so at first I'm thinking, screw this guy, like what a dick. And then I start going, no, he's telling me something I need. So I go talk to Louis. And I'm like, Louis, George tells me I need more arm strength, because I was doing the normal thing like a lot of you guys that aren't highly trained. I would come off my chest and my elbows would pop out, and then I would finish with a lot of shoulder, which I was 19, so it wasn't damaging yet. But if I'd have kept benching that way, I'd have been in big trouble. And so Louis says, you got to do these rollbacks, so we'll do them today, and showed me the JM press and all the things that are fairly common knowledge now. But you got to remember, back then there was no internet, or the internet was just starting. So to find these specialized exercises, unless you were digging deep, were very difficult. So case in point, I take these exercises to heart. I go back home to Indiana, and I'm traveling back and forth when I can, because I'm still working and going to school. So I probably make it over to Louis' place like twice a month, around minimum, and then in the summertime a little more.
And your degree at Ball State's no walk in the park.
No. I mean, you're dealing with guys that are not going to sign off on your name.
Yeah.
Just, it's not a normal kinesiology degree.
Exactly.
These guys are the innovators, and they expect you to help them put out high level.
So you're a busy young man.
Yeah.
Plus you're competing.
So luckily Wade would be like, go over there and squat Fridays, bring back what you know or what you find out, and we'll start using it with the athletes, which was amazing, because at his time, Wade was the only master CSCC strength coach in the MAC. And he also played pro football for the Dolphins and the Bengals. So he's 6'6", 280 with a 4.65 40, and he could have been like, you powerlifters, whatever.
Yeah.
I play pro ball. You're not gonna tell me what to do. He was actually interested in what I was bringing back from Louis. We were bringing back chains. Nobody had seen chains. This is 1999. Bands were just becoming something at Westside Barbell, and the way they became that way was somebody just threw a box of bands down. like, and say, try them out.
Yeah.
So George and Louie and Chuck are all measuring with like deer scales and trying to figure out like bar speed differences. I mean, it was very innovative, at the time. So I'm bringing all this stuff back to Wade.
Like you said earlier, there's a trade of information going on.
Yeah.
Plus, the other theme that I see throughout your life, besides people pushing you right direction, would just be trying to keep yourself humble.
Yeah,
he tells you your triceps are garbage. Like you said, you could have been pissed off and just been like, I'm going home.
Well, and the interesting
but you
thing
turned
is,
it around. You
so
came
6
back.
months, and well, this is interesting. So 6 months later, I've been taking all this exercises that Louis taught me, and I'm blasting the shit out of them at my house. And I come back, and George doesn't see me because I can't stay every Sunday. I'm mostly going there to squat and deadlift, and because I felt like that's what I needed the most. And so I could make it down Fridays, sometimes Sundays, but that's a 3-hour drive one way. So it's hard to get there both days. So I would go some Sundays and a lot of Fridays because Chuck's like, you're strong, man. You got to be in my group. So I'm like, well, you don't turn down when Chuck says something. So it was hard for me to come both days. Well, 6 months later, George sees me again, and I started getting that meat, back on my elbow, and George was an open book. He wasn't a dick to me anymore, and he started teaching me anything I wanted to know. And then 9 months later, I benched my first 550 raw. I was stuck at 500 for like a year and a half. So he knew where my weaknesses were, but he's like, I was just testing you. If I tell you something sucks, you're either going to take that as a negative or a positive, and I wanted to see who I was dealing with.
So, you were trying in the moment, to make a name for yourself. You did, 90 pounds for 9 reps. But as it turns out, 6 months later, you made a name for yourself with him, at least, inroads, by doing what he said and taking that to heart. And that connects to some of the stuff that we're going to get into here with longevity, looking 10 years from now, 5 years from now. 10%
gain in 9 months when you're already benching 500 is pretty impressive.
That's impressive.
And that's what it comes down to. It's very difficult because you don't see, in my opinion, I think training has regressed 20 years from where it is now, from where it was back then. And a lot of that's because the innovators of periodization and a lot of the people that really understood training are all gone. So Mevdiev's been dead for a while. Verkhoshansky's been dead for a while. Poliquin died in 2018. You got all these guys that really were the sharp minds of the industry. Nobody's stepping up and replacing them. Now it's all intensity and it's all, just get the weight up. And it's nothing about learning how to outsmart getting stronger. You don't see anybody posting anything about that. It's all intensity. And really, consistency will beat intensity at almost every time it's ever tested. If you give me somebody that will go 90% for 10 years and never get hurt, it'll be stronger than a guy who can go 100% for only a year and a half.
And that's what I took away from talking with Ed Cohen, who you toured with Poliquin, doing seminars, so I know that you know him very well. And that, that seeing that, having that vision. But what I think is miraculous for you is that when I was 19, I didn't even know what was happening like the next day. So trying to think ahead, trying to see that, okay, I'm going to take the next couple months, I'm going to really work towards this. That's a 19-year-old with some vision. Now, I'm not just here to compliment you and make you feel special about yourself. So you started to get into some history of things with periodization. And I wanted to ask you, so, conjugate comes over from Russia, essentially, from Soviet Union. And, one of the GOATs, Alexeyev, he becomes a coach after breaking every record known to man in the Olympics.
Still has the most world records ever in Olympic lifting with, I think, 75 world records in Olympic lifting. So the career span was just ungodly, the amount of stuff that he would do. But his warm-up, what started the winning warm-up in the time frame was Alexeyev would swing a 50-pound kettlebell for 15 minutes straight before he touched a barbell. Amazing. Figure eights, regular kettlebell swings, overhead kettlebell swings. There's all kinds of information on it. He would do a lot of stuff out of water for accommodative resistance because nobody had figured out bands or chains yet. And what happened was Alexeyev was the first athlete that was allowed to pull away from the traditional Bulgarian-Russian system, which was 10 or 12 exercises rotated in basically a cut-throat way to where the specificity is so high that you find the super freaks like the Bo Jacksons and you damage hundreds of people to find 2. So the Russians figured out that that's not a great way to do things because if we spend millions of dollars to get these guys up to high tier, what they call master of sport, but they're already broken and injured by the time they get there, it's not a good idea, right? So 1972 was the first inclination that Medvedev would take these classic 8 or 10 exercises and made about 20 of them. So he doubled the volume, doubled the modes. So instead of saying just power clean snatch, overhead squat, he would add in back squats, split squats, all these variations that have similarities to the Olympic lifting, but are just different enough that they can rotate and have transfer. And what they found by 1976 Olympics was that the entire Soviet team was so dominant, it was unbelievable because they added in so many variations. This is where variability becomes very important, because the quickest way to get strong is specificity, but it's also the quickest way to create mileage. So if you guys watch any of my stuff, you'll realize when I'm at peak level, I only squat with a straight bar every 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Because any more than that, I'm damaging my bench with my shoulders. My technique's already so good, I'm not going to get any better doing it. So now I analyze the straight bar squat, look for the weaknesses, and then use the other bars and implements that bring about those weaknesses, so that 3 weeks later I've enhanced the weak points, and now the squat technique is not only better, the weight's easier. But see, it's a more cognitive approach. It's not just 10, 8, 6, 5, 4 with a certain percentage, So 76 is when they first implemented at an Olympic level. Alexeyev becomes Olympic Athlete of the Year, beating every sport on the front cover of Sports Illustrated. You can look it up. That's when Alexeyev initially turned into a coach and took about 70 guys and made the Dynamo Club. The Dynamo Club was the most elite hand-selected guys from Medvedev and Alexeyev to utilize this new piecemeal conjugate system, which when they were done had almost 90 variations of the clean and jerk and snatch.
Man.
And by 1984, they had held every world record. They had massive amounts of athletes that were not only insanely strong, but very low mileage. So they could be rotated at every world championship game because none of them were beat up, because the stimulus was changing on a consistent basis. Do you guys understand now why the conjugate system was developed? It's developed to enhance volume loading with reducing mileage, which is, if you're trying to be really good for a long time, is very, very important. So if you look at your style of training and go, is this set up to be good in 10 years? Or is this set up only to be good in 10 weeks and then leave with a bunch of injuries? There you have it. The problem is that conjugate system is very, very heavily reliant on knowing what you need at what time. And this is a very big problem because a lot of people don't like training their weaknesses, right? They want to train what they're good at. They want to see, I want to go from A, B, C, D, E. I want to see linear progression strength. We all know linear progression doesn't work, especially at the advanced level. I mean, if it was just as easy as adding 5 pounds every week, why don't we have multiple 1,000-pound squatters? Or multiple, like dozens, if not like hundreds of 900-pound deadlifters or 600-pound benchers? Because it's not that easy, right? It's more complex than that. I mean, us sitting here right now, the human body is one of the most complex organisms that you could possibly fathom. So think about it in just strength terms. You got muscle contraction, right? That includes fiber type, neurological control of both agonist and antagonist muscle groups, right? So neurological overtraining. You got levers, you got hormones, you got all the blood work, you got nutrient delivery, energy systems. I mean, and then you want to write a simplistic program and wonder why it doesn't work.
Or write a program that 100,000 people are all going to do the same thing.
Yeah, you can't, and why can't it be cookie cutter? Well, unfortunately, not all of you guys are built like me, and I'm not built like you. So there are going to be some things you could utilize that I train, and other things you'll have to discard. That was the whole purpose of the piecemeal conjugate system. You found a conglomerate of exercises that you could rotate that worked really well for you, that allowed strength to rise without increasing mileage. That's the whole point.
So Bill Peanuts West, he's out in California doing his thing. Over in the Soviet Union, we've got the birth of conjugate, and then Louis Simmons is combining all of this. Names his gym Westside in homage to Bill Peanuts West.
Yeah.
And
George Friend.
Yep. So then we come to you entering Westside, and you're coming from your high school days where you're mostly, from what I've heard on your channel. And by the way, when he says watch my stuff, he's talking about you can get on YouTube, and someone asked me yesterday, hey, how'd you prepare for Matt Wenning for tomorrow? And I said, I watched his YouTube. Like
Yeah.
he's got 100,000 videos out there.
It's interesting why
So-
people think I get pissed off when they ask questions when all you had to do was watch the videos and it's right there.
Exactly. So,
So-
everything I'm asking is coming from your YouTube.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
really not like a mystery. I'm not some like,
Yeah.
you know, idiot savant.
Yeah.
So,
and that's
yeah.
one thing I think that really, Louis was an open book to me for his knowledge. And the reason was when I showed up and asked a question, he already knew I read all of his articles. So I already had an idea. See, you know, when somebody comes up and asks you a certain question, you know if they've really been reading your shit. Because their question will be a deeper level, right? So if I see this surface level question, I know you're not digging for it. You're expecting me to be your library.
Well, with that in mind, that set the bar for me and made me made me want to dig in. So hopefully this question meets that standard.
Yeah, yeah.
So my question isn't just like, you know, tell me some crazy stories about Westside. It's more when it comes to training, you go from this linear training style to where you're just trying to crush it, to now conjugate. What was that like, or were you so like struck by Westside in general that you just went with the flow? I mean, that switch is an abrupt switch.
Well, you know, I came from linear periodization, but by the time I had met Louis, again, with that 500-pound bench, my shoulders were already starting to, they weren't hurt, but they were starting to be agitated. My knees didn't hurt, but they were becoming agitated. I didn't have the variation at the YMCA. We had straight bars, we had a couple of different things, but we didn't have a lot of stuff. So we would use this classic linear periodization system that Louis realized too that was no good as far as long-term development. And so going to Louis was almost a breath of fresh air because I could feel my 1-rep maxes starting to not only change in strength, but change in power. I was getting quicker. So I started to realize, like, Louis was the first guy I'd heard talk about getting faster to get stronger. And then as I started digging more, I started seeing guys getting stronger to get faster, i.e. Charlie Francis. You know, Charlie Francis had Ben Johnson squat 625 for 3 reps at 190 body weight right before the 88 Olympics.
He's a sprinter.
And he broke the all-time world record in the fucking 100-meter dash.
Yeah.
How do you do that? You got to be strong enough to do it. So what he saw with Ben Johnson, he was a fast starter, but by the time he hit 50 meters, he was getting slower because he was running out of strength.
The capacity
So
wasn't
if he
there.
made a strength in a 3-rep max, it took about 9.5 seconds, which is how long it takes to run a 100-meter dash. That was the first time I'd ever heard a time component to strength. And that's when I started realizing I don't know damn near anything what I thought I knew.
So when it comes to that, I mean, the switch was probably abrupt, but you're seeing results. So you're sticking with it.
Yeah.
But you're still a guest lifter. You're still part-time at Westside.
Yeah.
So I heard you speak on one of your videos and how you mentioned that, you know, there was a very different treatment to the guests versus the full-time lifters.
Yeah.
So that transition to full-time.
In some ways, you are a little guarded as a guest because Louis won't have as many expectations on you, but he'll also guard you a little bit from the guys because remember, too, it was that generation. And a lot of it, too, I can see it now as an older lifter, is those guys were on the, Dave Tate and them were on the way out. They had hit their prime. They were starting to skate out. The new generation was coming in. There was a drift to that. You know what I mean? It's hard to let go that you're not the best anymore and a new kid is coming up and getting ready to take your spot. And that's exactly what Louis was farming us for. Myself, Greg Panora, Vlad, you know, got first guy to squat 1250. We were all getting groomed to be the next generation. And so I can understand now why there was that tension. But Halbert and Chuck and Louis really gravitated to me because every time I came back, I took what they taught me and I used it 100%. They knew it because technique changed, muscle groups got stronger. You know, the things they were telling me to do, I was doing, and they could see it. And, you know, it's easy to teach somebody. Every time you see them, you know they're taking what you tell them to heart because now they're like, this kid wants to be the best. And so the transition, I break all the collegiate national records in 2003. I squat my first over 700 right when I turned 20. So I had all the USAPL records, and I was the only guy wearing a Westside Barbell shirt in the USAPL, squatting wide stance. You know, it was a little funky because they still have.
You
that
stood
problem.
out a little bit.
Yeah. So 2004, I start my master's degree. Louis tries to talk me out of getting my master's, which would have been a really bad idea.
I heard about that, yeah.
You know, you don't need that shit. You get over here and get strong. You're wasting your prime years, you know.
I was kind of hoping you'd do a Louis impersonation on my podcast, so
yeah,
that just checks a box
pretty
right,
close.
box right there.
So
it's pretty good.
I that was the one time, well, there's multiple times, but that was the one good time I did not listen to him.
Yeah.
Because he had no faith in the education system, and rightfully so. But his mind was so glued onto that record board
Yeah.
that he didn't care. But I'll tell you what changed a ton. When I moved over there full time with my master's degree already set in place, now I was second tier down because now all of a sudden he recognized that I had a master's, so it gave him credibility too. So on one side, he
And you're
wanted me
writing
to-
for him, you're answering emails, so
Yeah,
it doesn't
I'm
hurt
working for the-
to have this kid with a master's that knows what he's talking
the
about.
Westside certification, initially, I completely designed myself. And like I said, if you read any of Louis' books, you'll get my point. He understands what he's talking about, but as far as writing things down, it's very confusing and very hard to digest or even utilize. So that's what
So
I'm trying to
you were
fix
the
with-
translator.
Yeah, I was pretty much the translator. And you got to remember, Louis barely graduated high school. You know, he barely had a 12th grade education. And at his generation, he got out and went into construction. So you could understand that him being able to even digest some of those Russian manuals. I mean, I even open them up still and find like, shit, I didn't see that 15 years ago. Then I'll make a note.
Sure.
So
Well, then, when you come on full-time, how quick is that switch of treatment that you're not
It's
a guest
big.
anymore, you're now part
the
of us?
pressure's on. So now
Okay.
you are owned.
Gotcha.
And it's weird because you're a pro athlete that's getting paid zero. So that's pretty
That's
interesting.
one of my questions, actually. How in the world did you support yourself?
Well, it was tough. I remember, moving over to Columbus, I had right about $800 in my checking account.
Nice.
And my first month's rent was $800. So it was sink or swim. But I knew if I stayed where I was at, that I was going to be a welder. And I wasn't, because, there wasn't any strength conditioning jobs other than wage job at Ball State as far as moderately high level.
So you did have the skill of welding to fall back on
Yeah, I
in terms of
did,
work, paying the bills if you had to.
Yeah. So the first place that would hire me, which is hilarious now looking back, the first place that would hire me right out of school, nobody cared I had a master's degree. Nobody cared I was an American record holder. Nobody cared I was a teen phenom. And I had to get a regular trainer job at a Lifetime Fitness.
Nice.
And I'm like, oh, I got to start all over again. So interestingly enough, that was the only Lifetime Fitness in Columbus and Easton, which is a very nice area, makes a lot of city connections, big businessmen. Because who's going to come in and train at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. or 12 a.m.? Independently wealthy people.
True.
So I start making these connections around town. Hey, would you train us like at, these times? I'm like, yeah. So about 6 months into it, I got 5 or 6 clients that are paying me really good money. And so I start talking to Louis about it. And Louis like, well, I don't know why you're working over there. Just bring him over here and train him, train him at Westside. And I'm like, these dudes ain't ready for Westside.
Yeah, they're going to piss their pants.
And, I'm telling them, you guys want to go train over there? Like, oh, yeah. And I'm like, are you sure you want to train over there? And so they would come in after we would work out, but it worked out really well because we had all the specialized stuff. And
Yeah,
as you well
the
know,
equipment.
a normal commercial gym is not going to have reverse hypers and glute ham raises, especially back in 2005. Like, they didn't have any of that stuff. No bands, no chains.
Well, not to backtrack too much, but that helped you with Ball State, too, because
yeah.
bringing in the equipment from Louis,
Yeah.
that got you
And Louis
guys
was
into
awesome.
the athletic gym.
He knew that we were one of the first colleges that were really absorbing his stuff, and he had a right-hand man there. He donated reverse hypers, glute ham raises. We had an entire, at least half of a gym set up that Louis just gave us.
So your power lifters were made.
Oh, they were made. I mean, I'll give you an example. We won best team in college in 2003 with 8 guys, and other teams had 50 dudes. I was gold at 275. My friend now that's a chiropractor was gold at 242. My football guy that I picked up, he was his last year, Torrey Scott, squatted 7, benched 550, and deadlifted 765 with 8 weeks of training and won the super heavyweight. So, yeah, if the NFL guys want to come and do powerlifting, all the records are shot for sure.
So there's this transition. Now you're full-time at Westside, and for about 3 years, you're there full-time.
Yep.
Things have changed. Now the treatment of you has changed, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
The intensity's changed too. And you mentioned earlier in this talk we're having about the intensity as far as the realistic intensity of it. So then how do you deal with that for those
Well,
years? When you go home, is there some way you unwind at night?
I don't know.
Like,
I was young enough that I didn't understand what was going on, and now that I'm older, I saw it. So what happened is Louis was getting a lot of back pressure from Omaha Barbell with
Okay.
Rick Hussey. Rick Hussey had 7 or 8 guys that were under 242 that were just ungodly strong. Sean Frankel, I can't remember all the other names, but they had some Grandick, James Grandick. They had some guys that were breathing down our necks as far as them being the next gym that was going to be similar to Westside Barbell. And Louis hated that because he felt like he wanted the strongest gym in the world. Well, the difference was is Rick Hussey was very big into training with squat suits and bench shirts all the time. There was no raw training. And I knew personally that that was the wrong thing to do. But Louis just felt so much pressure at the meets that you guys would be getting better so much faster if we just practiced the gear. My side of it was, if we don't have any raw strength under the gear, it doesn't matter because eventually you're just putting Band-Aids on bullet holes, right? If you're not stronger underneath, eventually it's going to call you out. You have to get stronger underneath. And that's kind of what started the riffing point.
But I mean, what I'm trying to get at, Matt, is that, you know, I know 42-year-old or 43?
Yeah, I'll be 44 this year.
Yeah, I know 43-year-old Matt. I've seen your fridge from your YouTube channel. I've seen that you respect sleep. Dr. Matt Walker, the sleep dude, probably loves you.
Yeah.
So, but that's 43-year-old Matt Wenning. I'm talking about 24-year-old Matt Wenning.
Yeah.
How do you deal with it when you just got, you know, the crap kicked out of you at the gym that day? You just got screamed at by 5 different dudes, and then your boss, Louis, tells you that, you know, things aren't looking good. You go home, is 24-year-old cracking a beer? Are you reading a magazine, watching a movie to relax? What's your way to unwind?
There was no way to unwind. Like the level of training that we had, you had to be so mentally tough every day. I mean, some of the training days were tougher than doing contests. And a lot of it's because we felt that we had to compete against each other even in the contests. And that's where I think, as I got closer and closer to Louis and us having fallouts, is Louis started non-adapting the Russian system of understanding complete recovery and waving to a Bulgarian system that was really almost max effort constantly, because he felt, I think some of it was his health was going down at that time, which I can't believe he lived as long as he did. If you ever stayed in hotel rooms with him, you would know why. He had to sleep sitting up. He would only sleep maybe a half an hour every 3 hours because he got trached when he was, I would say in the mid 80s for just a knee scope. They gave him the wrong anesthetic and killed him on the table and tried to cover it up. So the way Westside Barbell got started was Louis had a humongous lawsuit that he had won through a medical system or center, and that allowed him to just focus on the gym. But it also screwed his sleep up so bad that by the time I knew him, he was on 2 boxes of Tylenol PMs just to sleep a couple hours a night.
Wow.
So obviously that's going to fry your brain after a while.
Sure.
So a lot of that stuff was compounding, making the issue bad. But my way to deload was basically I would sleep 12, 13 hours a day. So I would go work 5, 6 hours. I would train an hour, and the rest of the time was laying around watching movies and trying to relax because training was going to happen with that same muscle group 72 hours later. So you just had to be prepped. So that level of intensity can only be, you know, if you're pouring all your water out of your glass in training, nothing else can be a stressor. So it was complete isolation. There were Christmases and birthdays and weddings that family had that I wouldn't go home to because I was training for a contest. I mean, literally, because the 2.5-hour drive there and back would screw up my back or make my legs feel messed up the next day to squat, and that wasn't worth it to me. That's the level of dedication that they demanded.
The transfer to full time was that he owns you. Well, even indirectly, that level of commitment.
Yeah. And I knew that's what
puts you into that.
Because I didn't have the best genetics. I know it sounds crazy saying the numbers that I've said at those years, but remember the leg breaking to get those squats and deadlifts up to a point that I could break world records was every ounce of energy that I absolutely had. So to do that, I knew I had to pour everything I could in my mid-20s to break the world records. And so for me, it wasn't even a choice. Like I knew that to do something great, I was going to have that level of commitment because I couldn't go out and party and have a handful of beers and get up the next morning and squat. My body just wouldn't allow it. I was pushing the genetic limit.
But the world records didn't come till after Westside.
Yeah,
so that's a good segue to the downfall of things.
Kind of getting into that. So Louis shifts into more of a Bulgarian system. The speed day starts turning into competition, which it shouldn't be. The max effort days are pushing far beyond 90, 95%. Some days over plus that. Guys were breaking a lot of PRs in the meet or in the gym, but then they go to the meets and bomb out because they'd already blown their wads in the gym. Well, that's not proper periodization. So I'm trying to lay out with Medvedev's books. I'm trying not to have it just come from me. I'm like, Louis, look what Zatsiorsky and Medvedev and these guys are saying. We're not timing our training correctly. We're not building in enough
You're giving them the research.
restitution and rest. Nah, that's bullshit, you know. And I'm like, dude, no, I'm telling you, every 3 to 4 weeks,
Yeah.
we need to take down the training about 50% and let our bodies regenerate, and we're going to see massive
have a
amounts of
deload.
growth.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't go over very well. So the third week that I did that, Louis basically sits me in the office and kicks me out. And kicks me out
and there was
because
other
I'm
stuff, too.
building recovery. Yeah. And a lot of it was we were squatting raw that day.
Okay.
And Louis hated that if we didn't have at least briefs on, he was pissed. And now looking back at it, the reason was it made him feel bad because he was older. He'd been 10 years older than I am now, and he still liked to squat with us. Obviously, he wasn't doing the same weights, but we're doing it all in gym shorts and a belt.
Yeah.
And he's got to put a bunch of layers on to hang, even with the warm-up, so it pisses him off.
Sure.
And I don't realize it's an ego thing. I'm just like, I don't care about egos because when I first met you, all you cared about was numbers. So if what I'm doing is working, why mess with it, right? So I'm hitting like literally 765 and 3 chains on each side in a belt. Keep in mind the world record is 822 at the time, raw, squat, no sleeves, no knee wraps. So 765
And that's
and
in
3
the gym
chain.
that you're doing these things.
That's 880 at the top. And I'm already far beyond the world record raw, and I'm an equipped lifter. Because you remember, back at that time, there was no raw and equipped. If you went pro in equipment. There was no raw divisions. Nobody cared. That's just the way it was in the late 2000s.
Well, I mean, John Inzer, it was 1983 that he came out with some of his stuff.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the relevance historically of equipped, the equipment that made equipped lifting wasn't even invented till the 80s.
Yeah.
So
the
then
80s.
you're in the, the early 2000s.
Early
It's not
2000s,
even-
the first multiply stuff starts coming out.
Yeah.
They start understanding the sew patterns to help the equipment. I mean, back in the old days, the old bench shirts, they would cut your skin up more than they would help. You might get 20 pounds out of a bench shirt and look like somebody shot you with a.
Donnie Thompson says he wants his bench shirt back, by the way.
I don't think I have it.
Oh, he says you've got his bench shirt.
Well,
and I'm not going to argue with
Well,
Donnie.
I mean, think about it. If I have his bench shirt, he weighed 390 and I weighed 310. I don't think it's
Yeah.
going to fit.
Well,
But-
you know how you told me before this started to tell Matt Vincent something
Yeah.
tomorrow? By the way, we'll be doing this again tomorrow with Matt Vincent. Donnie told me to tell you that.
Okay,
so,
cool.
yeah, we can debate that afterwards.
I may
he's
have
just,
it, but I
he's
don't
just
know.
giving you some shit. But
that's cool.
apparently he loaned it to you, and he says you never gave it back.
Oh, well.
But you can follow up with him. But I think, what you're pointing out in terms of the history of things is important, that there was no division of things when you started. You're just going for the record, and when you go for the record, you're using, all the equipment available to you. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, and that's the thing. But what I noticed was if I did this 3-week wave, again, Louis' principles that he was not using at the time was I would go completely raw, then I would go a little bit of gear, then I would go all the gear, then I would deload. No gear, medium gear, lots of gear, deload. And what I noticed is that wave was doing this, right? And we were all getting better. The last nail in the coffin was, at the time, Bill Crawford was the best shirt bencher in the world. He had an 850 bench at 242 in a shirt. And what was interesting is Crawford couldn't bench 405 raw. He had learned how to use this shirt so well, so technically well, that he could figure out. I'm thinking, well, shit, if I can bench 600 without a shirt and he teaches me this, what am I capable of? Well, my bench was stuck right at 700 for probably about a year and a half. So one of my friends and one of the other guys at Westside goes, let's go up to Detroit Barbell. Clay Brandenburg was running that, and said, let's take this seminar with what's his name, Crawford. And I'm like, dude, Louis is going to be pissed because he wanted to teach this super tuck position and almost like a roll press. And Crawford taught an elbow out, tuck, and then right when the shirt lets, like you hear a press command, you just kick the elbow out and the shirt just, whoosh, right? So I never saw that, but he taught me. Case in point, 1 hour later after the seminar, Bill Crawford has me benching 750 for a double. 50 pounds more 2 times. So I'm like, oh, we got it.
Yeah, let's
I'm bringing
go.
this shit back to Louis. This is going to be awesome, right? Like, because I went and learned something new, and I just killed it.
Took an hour.
Remember that the biggest bench at Westside Barbell at the time was 810 by a bench-only guy. I just hit 750 the next weight class down as a power lifter. So I'm squatting before I bench, and I smoke this thing.
You weren't a specialist.
So now I'm bringing it back, and I'm showing Greg Panora, which is Louis' boy, because he got to world record class faster than I did. And so I bring it back, and I teach Greg how to do it. Greg smashes an 800. Well, you'd think, as a coach, you'd be happy. But if you're kind of ego-driven and it's not your technique, you could be pissed. I'm thinking, well, we're all about numbers. It doesn't matter whose technique it is. Let's just be the strongest gym in the world. Well, that's not how it was perceived. So those were kind of the two things that ended up being kind of an issue. And then Louis kicks me out. I'm almost ready to retire from lifting. I'm broke as shit. I'm 28. I'm 27 years old. You know, I'm not wasted, but I have dedicated all of this time in school, not worried about having any money. You know, I'm barely putting gas in my car, and all I've been doing is training and trying to work just to survive. And so, and I'm thinking, man, I need to do something else. Like, this isn't working. Well, within 2 hours, Vogelpool had left 2 weeks before I did because he had got into it with Louis too. He goes, "You want to train super top secret at this other gym and
Team Extreme.
Show up at Louis' meet and take all of his money?" And I'm like, "Yeah, let's do it." So we don't tape shit. It's closed gym. Nobody from the outside's allowed in this gym. Like 15
stealth.
minutes south, had all the shit we needed, right? And so we train. He goes, "Look, I'm going to listen to what you say with this deloading stuff and this shirt stuff, and I want to get my list back up." I'm like, "Dude, I know we were overtraining. If you just listen to what I'm saying." So I go to a bench only meet and smash 815, like just crush it.
Was the cat out of the bag by that point? Because the Cincinnati Pro-Am is Louis' meet that you're talking about.
Yeah, you can see all this go down on Westside versus the World.
Yes.
I'm telling you the story out of the movie.
Exactly. This is kind of like
This is legit.
This is like if you watch the director's cut or something.
Yeah,
so,
which I'm glad they made me look good in that video because it could have been really bad. I talked a lot of shit they cut out.
Well,
which I'm glad they cut it out.
That's why I'm here, Matt. so let's get into some of that. So so you're training, Team Extreme, you and Chuck, it's under the radar. You go to the raw bench competition, or not raw,
yet.
not raw yet. This is just a bench
I
competition.
go to a bench only and I smack the 815 and I'm like, okay, if I plug that into my total, it's game over, right? So
is the cat out of the bag though? Is
the cat's
word
not out of the
gotten
bag
around
because there's
to
no videos
Louis?
yet. Like you can't just. This is 2007. You can't just, or 8. You can't just take a video
Well,
with
you're
your
running
phone.
the same circles. You don't think Louis knew about it?
Well,
at
we
that
went
point?
far enough away.
Okay.
And maybe even if he did, you know, he's just, you know, that's just a one-hit wonder. He's not gonna, you know,
Gotcha.
that doesn't mean shit. You know, that's how he was. So we're training for squats and we're driving out to Dave Tate's under the radar.
Yeah.
Because there were certain things that we needed that we didn't
there's
have
an
at Team
accomplice.
Extreme. Well, kinda. He stayed out of everything.
Okay.
So I squat. I'm getting ready for this meet, and I squat 1,015 for a triple, and it is cake. And I'm like, it's over. I got the world record. The world record was 26:62, and I had to hit 26:65. So we show up under the radar, in the last minute, me and Chuck put our entries into the meet, so Louis can't see it.
So
it's too
even entering the meet, you waited to the last minute.
last minute. So
Oh, man.
that way we could really screw with him. Because what I
man
didn't
on a
want him to
mission.
do was change any of the judges or do anything weird. I mean, he could be pretty bad with some of that stuff. So we showed up. The story goes, you know, I break the world record total, and I'm only out of Westside 7 months. Keep in mind, my total from adding in these deloads and these things I'm telling you with these waving systems, instead of just going balls to the wall every day in the same style, my total went from 2465 to 2665 in 8 months. That's the difference in recovery. Think about that. 12% gain in 8 months. You're already top 3 in the world. And it was all because we weren't recovering enough. And it was right there in the books that Louis was preaching to us for years, but he wasn't listening to his own information.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He didn't think that you came down to come up, and that's the whole purpose. A great strength coach can make someone pretty strong all year round, and then they can taper in another 12% in a given 5 to 8 weeks if they know what they're doing.
So
But-
we've talked the good side of your experience at Westside. We're hitting the bad side. Before we move on, you know, when you weigh those things on a scale, did you get more out of it than you lost? Would you still have it in your career?
I think there's a 50-50. I think what I learned was, okay, I came to Westside Barbell with a 2150 total. I left with a 2450 total, and I would have never gotten to that point without understanding what level of intensity it was going to entail to go to those numbers. Because I could tell you guys all day what it takes to break a world record. Until you are around people that every one of your training partners has done that before, you don't realize the intensity level it takes to train. It's not like, I'm going to the gym today. It's like, I'm scared to go to the gym today because I might go to the hospital like every 4 days a week. I mean, like, you know, you're driving there, you're like, oh, dude, this is going to be bad. You know what I mean? Like, for like years at a time.
Yeah. It's like a traumatic experience.
So I learned just as much of what not to do as what to do. I knew
Sure.
that I had to have that level of intensity to get better, but I also knew that I had to drop that intensity down occasionally to recuperate myself.
So the magic genie pops out of the bottle and says, hey, do you want to take this out of your life? You're going to say, no, keep it in.
But technically, you know, and we don't have to get into it, but like, you know, I've always fought that Ben Patrick knees over the toes stuff, because if you look at almost every world record squat, they maintain a fairly level vertical shank to load the posterior chain. When you drop that knee way forward, which most beginners do, my point being is that I came to Louis and my squat was good. I left Louis and my squat was amazing, technical wise. And I had to have that to be 6'1" and squat world records, because I'm competing against guys like Eric Lillibridge's size, 5'10", same weight, 3 inches shorter. I mean, the leverages that they had were unbelievable. The only way to beat people with better leverages, better technique, right? So when I left Louis, my technical skill on all those lifts were much higher. But I also learned leaving what not to do and making sure that recovering is just as important as pushing. And that's where it becomes a very fine line. And the stronger you get, the gray area becomes smaller and smaller. What's optimal? Well, when you're beginner, everything's optimal because you suck at everything, right?
Yeah, it all looks good.
You know, I hate to say it, but it's easy to go from shit to suck, and it's hard to go from good to great.
Yeah.
Really. Because anything works in the beginning, and that's why so many cookie cutter programs you see in the fitness industry are out, because they're banking on the fact that you're probably only going to do it diligently for 8 weeks. You know, that's the biggest thing. Like,
That's why your programs, you're very, blatant that don't follow this to a T. It's just a guide.
Right. And then usually if somebody wants me to coach them or my team, I won't touch them unless they want at least 36 weeks, because that's how long it takes to actually make any real changes. If you come to somebody with weak hamstrings, that's not fixed in 2 sessions.
So this is HomeGymCon and Home Gym History podcast. So for a home gym guy, like I lift at 5 a.m. by myself in my basement gym. So, when you're by yourself, on one hand, you can focus on the weak points because you don't have any kind of peer pressure around you. But on the other hand, you're on your own. So what's your advice? What kind of things do you have for someone like that that's not in a commercial gym?
Well, you want pieces in your equipment, especially if you have limited space, that can do multitudes of things. How many of you guys follow me on Instagram? Okay. Get on my page. This is ridiculous. So
I was going to say,
the reason I'm telling you this is this reason. One, I could show you about 20 different ways to use a reverse hyper. It's not just for your lower back. I could show you.
And even the reverse hyper, the
I could show you 6 or 8 different things to do with the glute ham raise you'd never even thought of. If you're on the channel, you'd already seen it. Point being is that you want pieces in your gym that can do multitude things. For instance, my belt squat machine, bent over rows, deadlifts, glute bridges, donkey calves, squats, narrow stance squats, elevated heel squats. All that can be done on that one machine. So the point is that if you have pieces that you can do tons of stuff with, it is a big bang for your buck as far as space is concerned. The next thing is, when you select heavier implements or exercises to do, you always figure out a way to develop spotters. You want machinery and or setups that you can bail from safely. Okay, so if you were to say, look at my belt squat, we have a center post that you can change the height of, and it will be there about a ½ inch lower than where you squat. And then if you get in trouble, you can set it down and click out of it. How many machines have you seen that do that? Not that many. See?
I don't want to derail my own question too much, but since you brought up your belt squat, that's something I wanted to ask you about. That 1973, Louis breaks his back, he comes up with a belt squat.
Reverse hyper.
Yeah, reverse hyper, but then also didn't he also come through with a belt squat as well?
Well, without getting into the politics of things, it's very difficult because
I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to.
No, and
I don't want to step on any toys.
But the hard part is Louis has or had U.S. patents on machines that were already invented in Europe. They just hadn't been invented in the United States.
Okay.
I thought it was really interesting. In the late 90s, I was still friends with Eddie, and I was still going to Louis. And I was at a meet, and I was talking to Eddie, and I was like, man, have you seen that machine that Louis made, that reverse hyper? And he starts laughing. And I'm like, what are you laughing about? He goes, I'll send you something in the mail in a couple weeks. I'm like, whatever. I don't think anything of it. Well, a couple weeks later goes by, and I get this envelope from Ed Cohen from Chicago, and it's an old magazine from Finland or Sweden, and there's a reverse hyper in there from 1955.
So yeah, a lot of this
So
stuff.
I start going, okay, how much
It's
of
been
this
around.
is right? So now I'm like, how much of this did he invent, and how much of this did he steal?
Yeah.
The same thing goes true with how many of you guys have seen the plyo swing? You guys seen this plyo swing? You've never seen it? Okay, well, if you go into Zatsiorsky's Science, Practice, and Strength Training, there was a plyo swing made in the Soviet Union in 1964. So again, I give him all the credit in the world for going to look that up and making the U.S. patent, but
Sure.
when you actually invent something, it's got to be something from scratch. I didn't invent the bell squat. I just made it better.
Well,
you
that's
know?
what I was going to ask. How did you make it better? So you're mentioning some things.
So how I made it better was I trained with it, okay? So when people and engineers and people that want to sell products, you need to get in there and bang with your products and find out where the weak points are. So the first time I built the belt squat, I don't need gussets here. It's strong enough. Break the goddamn weight, it almost breaks my leg. That's not strong enough. Fix it there.
Nice.
Next time I break this part. All right, fix it there. Well, if you're putting 800, 900, 1,000 pounds on it every so often, you're going to find the weak points pretty fast on yourself. So I find that a lot of places and companies will build stuff without having anybody that's a real ass kicker
Well, that
use
was
it.
something I screamed into the mic just before this. Just before coming up here, I was the MC for the, or at least the
strongman.
live MC for the Strongman Log, and Chris from Belt Fed Strength. They make belts that are a piece of art, but also functionally excellent, in my opinion.
Yep.
He just put 300 something over his head on the log, and that's what I screamed into the mic. If you're going to buy something, look at the man who just made it.
Yep.
That's a man who knows what a belt should be.
Yep.
Well, same idea. You use the squat.
If I wouldn't have
the
built that belt squat and had it at the right timing, I really truly believe I would have never been capable of breaking the all-time world records raw. Because with raw training, you have to have a little bit higher volume than equipped training. Okay, there's one small difference there. How do you create more volume with less mileage? You're not going to do that with the classical lifts. So I get people messaging me all the time, well, Matt, can I just do winning warm-ups with a barbell squat? No, it defeats the purpose. You can occasionally, but how do you create that technique and motor pattern with less mileage? You find higher traction-based exercises. So if I can do a belt squat for 4 sets of 25, it allows my spine to last a lot longer than doing it with a barbell squat. This is where it gets very difficult as a home gym owner. You need to be very careful and understand that you can't build a hot rod with a hammer and a screwdriver. You're going to need specialty tools eventually. I mean, and that's the big problem. And I don't care which models you buy or which companies you support. I don't care. But eventually, you're going to have variety in your gym. So if you have pieces that can do multiple things and can last forever, you're better off buying the more expensive stuff that you never have to replace and never breaks.
Now, what about coaching, training, that kind of thing? When you're a home gym owner, you know, you've got some options. There's some internet kind of things, or you got a online coach, things like that, training programs you can buy. And we've talked a lot already about cookie cutter programs.
Well, would you remember that the human body is a very difficult organism? If you're going to go copy something off the internet that's not made for you, it's probably a really bad idea over the long term. Now, if you suck, it's going to make you better because you already suck.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean it's optimal for you. So if you're creating a lot of mileage and a lot of bad technical proficiency on top of work, it's not going anywhere. Your technique must be perfect. The only way to have it perfect is to have professionals watch it. So I find that it's very interesting that people, they're okay with saving money and cutting corners on programming until go find out how much it costs when you blow your ACL off. Go out, find out how much it costs when your patella ruptures. Go find out how much it costs to put back on your rotator cuff, and you're going to find that personal training is a lot cheaper than that.
And not just financial costs, but what's your life going to be like after that?
And the thing of it is, guys, is that once you injure, and how many of you guys have had a pretty severe injury? Did you ever get it back to where it felt like it wasn't injured? Exactly. So if you're going to use a system or a coach that's going to probably injure you, and you're never going to have that joint integrity again, that doesn't sound like a very good idea to me. Because I think for most of us, we're not here to try to necessarily break world records. We want to train for 20, 30 years, have fun with it, get stronger, but not get beat up from it. Exactly. And that should be the questions that we're asking ourselves. So how do you spot that? Well, one, if you hire an online coach and they're not asking you what equipment you have, they're not asking your chronological age, they're not asking you how long you've been training, and they're not taking and seeing videos of your technical proficiency in the lifts, you're getting played. Because all of that stuff matters. Like, You remember me telling you when I squat with a straight bar, I'm very analytic with it. Okay, so this upcoming Saturday, I'm going to squat with a straight bar. I'm going to watch it from 3 different camera angles, and then any little inefficiency that I see will dictate the training for the next 3 weeks. I'm picking the exercises that are bringing about my shortcomings so that the next time I use it, it's not a shortcoming. Make sense? If you're really good at math, but you suck at English, why keep studying math? Fix the things that you suck at. But that's the problem, see? You have to train the things you don't like. And that's where it gets hard, because for most of us, this is a hobby. It's not a profession. So you tend to gravitate towards the things you like to do. If you don't like squatting, you're probably not going to do it very often, right? Or you're not good at it, you don't like to do it.
So, if you really have that goal in your hobby, in your home gym, you got to be realistic with yourself.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
So that makes sense to me. And I mean, it loops back to the belt squat machine, because that came after a slight, I don't even know the exact, but a slight shoulder issue.
Well, it wasn't my shoulder issue. So I was training a guy named Mike Kula that had the all-time NFL combine record. He did 49 reps in 2006. He had a 37.5-inch vertical at 280 body weight and played for the Steelers, okay? Pittsburgh. He was probably one of the freakish athletes I've ever seen come out of Ohio State, both in size, speed, and strength. He had a 500-pound raw bench that looked explosive. I never had him go heavier than that, because why? The point is that he had basically his last year of playing pro football. He's playing for the Steelers. He gets slightly off balance and falls on his right arm, and then a guy tackles him on top and takes his humerus bone right through the back of his shoulder blade, blows it completely out. So his football career is over. 2 pins in his shoulder, a bunch of reattachments. Within a year and a half of coming back into the gym, I had him bench 405 for 5 with 2 pins in his shoulder. But initially, when he wanted to squat, he couldn't get under a straight bar because his shoulder was so jacked. So this was 2010. So I made this machine for him to be able to squat. And then I'm like, wait a minute. Well, this machine will put it all on my hips and my legs and give my back a break. And so I started adding in the Wenning warm-ups with the volume, and now I'm doing 100 squats before I even do normal squats. And what I started noticing is my technique got better, my ligaments and tendons got denser. I almost became injury, like I couldn't be injured because my technique was so good, because I had basically greased the groove 100 freaking times before I even touched the bar. So how many of us have just walked in and started with a straight bar squat? All of us, right?
Yeah.
Or a straight bar bench. Well, the problem with that is you may not be activating the right muscles. And what is one of the main purposes of activation? Usually it's if something's wrong, it's guarding something. So if I warm up my upper back, right, with a lot of scapular rows or scapular retractions and triceps, well, if I give it a couple of minutes to rest and it recharges, where is my brain hot? It's hot in those muscle groups. Therefore, it's going to protect me and actually enhance my technique. So how Wenning warm-ups came about, which is probably what you're getting ready to ask next, it's a mixture of things. 2012, I get asked to go over to Australia and talk with the Sydney SWAT team. And they had a decent weight program at the time, but they weren't using anything conjugate-based. And so I'm showing them, hey, you got to rotate this and rotate that, because, wouldn't you know it, they had a bunch of mileage and a bunch of guys getting hurt because they're doing the same stuff over and over and over again. So I'm showing them all this stuff, and the next week, because I was over there for about a month. The next week, the ASCA National Conference was there, which is their NSCA National Conference. And there was a lady there that was getting her PhD. We were working with pro rugby. And she was talking about pre-fatigue sets and enhanced technique and performance. And I'm like, I never heard of that. You mean you're doing a bunch of work before you do your main lift? That sounds goofy as shit. And that's all I had. That's all I had from it, right? This is where it gets crazy. So 2012, I go do my first bench press. I get back from Australia. I do my first raw bench press meet as a pro and smoke 600 as a full meet lifter, which was really good because there were only maybe 14 guys that had ever done it in any weight class as a full lifter. And so I'm stoked because now I'm looking at the world record by Dan Kovacs at 2202. And I'm like, well, if I can squat the world record and then bench 600, I only got to pull like low sevens, and I got it.
Well, that's something I wanted to ask you was when it comes to that switch from equipped to raw, how much of it, in your mind at the time, that decision-making was like the writing on the wall in terms of what's being published and, all right, the tide is shifting this way, and how much of it was that meat?
For me, I felt like, honestly, after I squatted 1,200, I didn't have anything left in the gear. Like, okay. I had nothing left to prove, number one. I was the lightest human to ever squat 1,200. You know, I had bench pressed 844. I had deadlifted like well above 800. Combine them all together, I would have had the all-time world record total 10 times over. I just never could quite put it together all in one meet and the equip, but I knew that I didn't have anything left. And the other thing too is the time I squatted 1200, I picked the weight up, and right when I'm just getting the weight out of the rack, I feel my upper head just going pop, pop, pop. And those were blood vessels just cracking in my skull. Then right when the weight comes off, both nostrils just crack open. This is just picking the weight up out of the rack. This isn't even a squat yet.
Yeah.
And this is when you realize, oh shit, this is legit, right? And so as I'm going down, the weirdest feeling I had was my femurs bowing. Like I could feel my femurs like, it didn't feel like muscle. Like, I don't know how to tell you this, but muscle flexing and bone moving completely feel different, which you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized I did not have the testicles to do that anymore.
Yeah, you were hitting the capacity.
It was one of those things when I picked that level of weight up, I'm like, how long can you play with that level of insanity before something really bad happens? And I knew that eventually I was going to be a good coach. And so walking around or teaching people in a wheelchair is no bueno.
So have you ever heard the story of the first 1,000-pound squat? Because it reminds me of that.
Oh, yeah.
Waddington, Lee Moran.
Yeah, Lee Moran and Dave Waddington. And they probably had similar stories, but
well, Lee Moran passed out at 9:53, face first into the stage.
Yep.
So after the fact, it was learned that he almost severed his tongue.
Yep.
So there's blood. If you look at the picture, and there's a video of him, if you look at it, he's covered in blood. So it reminds me of that when you're mentioning like the blood vessels popping and blood coming down your nose.
If I remember correctly, Dave Waddington missed that 1,000-pound squat 3 or 4 times before he actually got it.
He did. And Moran won the competition, if you will. He did it first. But then the weights came off the bar on one side after that, and the barbell went flying like a missile.
That's what
that was
the
a wild
evolution,
time.
if I remember correctly, that was the evolution of the squat bar to go a foot wider so they could have more weights on it and clip it, because they were using a normal bar back then, which is totally insane, which is also why Bill Kazmaier retired from powerlifting. He got so big he couldn't even get under the bar anymore, and they hadn't had the longer bars yet. So imagine he squatted 881 in a bench press bar at 6'3", 350, and to get into that bar. He had to carry it so high. Me and him are really good friends.
Yeah.
It's like I had to carry it in my fingertips and on my neck because I couldn't get my shoulders to pull down, and he still squatted almost 900.
Kaz is the very first strength athlete I ever liked in life.
Yeah, I mean,
I was a kid and I saw World's Strongest Man on TV, and my life was changed. So that's awesome.
Yeah,
I love hearing about him.
He's an amazing guy. But like I said, Lee Moran and Dave Waddington were amazing guys. And like I said, it was Matt Dimmel was the first guy to do it at Westside, I think in 1989 or 90. Yeah. So he's a little bit before my time, but he was 6'2", 400 pounds. He was just a monster. But
when it comes to just bones bending and those kind of extreme things, there's only a handful of people in the world that have been in that position. So then you take yourself and you think, okay, I'm going to switch to raw. Like, I'm heading to raw now, but you've also got new goals. You've got new things to conquer.
So raw didn't start on my head as an automatic light bulb. What happened is I had been detached from George Halbert. He had stayed at Westside when I left, mostly because he just didn't have anywhere else to train. And I wouldn't say he got along real well with Chuck. So it wasn't like one of those things where we were all friends. We were training partners, and that's pretty much where it ended. And so George calls me, and it's been, I don't know, a couple of years. We talked on and off on text message or whatever, and he asked me, he goes, would you like to train with me? And I want to try to break Mike McDonald's raw bench record.
Okay.
And I'm like, well, how much is that? He goes, well, I have to do 582 at 198. And I'm like, well, yeah, man. I mean, I'll train with you for it. Screw it. I'll get a raw bench. So we go into the training for the raw bench, and I know he can do it, but he's already older and got some damage. So he's about a little younger than I am now, but he's got high mileage. And I'm still really fresh because I think I'm only right at 33. And so we go to train for the meet, and about 5 weeks out from the contest, George Halbert completely separates his shoulder in training. And he doesn't know that he has. He thinks he just tore something. So he asked me to take 5 cc's of fluid and inject it into his shoulder to swell it up like a balloon. Now, this is an old trick that the old timers used to use, where you would take saline water and you inject it into the joint which obviously is not going to do much on the surface, but what it does do is it creates an inflammation process that brings white blood cells into the area because they think there's massive trauma, which did happen there, but it causes it to heal faster, right? So we learned that from Dr. Serrano, which used to train Stallone and Mr. T. So I put this massive rig in his shoulder, and I'm like, oh my, watch it go. I'm like, I don't care how bad my shoulder hurts. I ain't doing that shit. Yeah. Right? So he hurts his shoulder and he's out, but I end up doing the meet and smoke 600. And that's when I started to look at the raw totals. And also I started seeing more and more covers on Powerlifting USA with raw lifters. I saw it coming. And I'm like, I'm just young enough that I can get 3 or 4 years in of the competitive raw stuff, and then I'll be the only lifter that's ever done it and equipped in raw. So that'd be kind of like winning NASCAR and then winning Formula One. Like, you don't see that. It's completely different, you know?
Yeah.
But because, even though Louis was mad at me, every third week I was training completely raw, it wasn't a really horrible shift to me because I was already at least once a month smashing large raw numbers. So the transition for me was actually pretty easy, but there was an advantage. So when I got out of the raw, of the gear lifting into raw, you got to remember, I'm used to handling 844 in my hands with a shirt. So when I take out 600, my brain's like, this is nothing. When I'm used to squatting 1200 with a bar in a suit, and now I only got to do 832, it's not that big a deal. I mean, in my mind, because you pick it up, no matter if you're in your gear or not, when you get it out of the rack, it's still on you. So now I've just cut that down by 400 pounds, and it feels light. So it was an easy transition for me, plus my technique mirrored equipped lifting anyway, right? Which I think it should anyway. But the point is the technique never changed. It was, you know, knees out, vertical shins, everything stayed the same.
So 2012 was that bench.
Yeah.
You're talking about 2014. 13, you break the record.
No, 13, this is where the winning warm-ups come into play.
Okay.
So in 2013, I go to do my first meet to break Dan Kovacs's 2202 record. Mm-hmm. I get there and I don't realize it's a walkout meet. It's not a monolift meet. I'm like, oh shit, I haven't walked out since like 04 when I broke the American records in college. Oh well, screw it. So I walk out, I hit like 788. Walk it back. I get to the bench, and I hadn't done that 600 bench after a squat yet. I get to the bench, 574 is a grind. I had just done like 570 for a triple in the gym. I didn't have the gas. I had just squatted close to the world record, and now my bench just took a 10% dump. And I'm like,
you're done for the day.
So I'm thinking to myself, what, you know, I'm driving home, and I hit the third highest total of all time anyway. But I'm driving home, right? I'm driving home, and I'm like, what is going on? Like, how do I fix this? Because that 600 bench with it by itself needs to be there after I squat. And then that light bulb goes off of that thing I was telling you about in Australia, that pre-fatigue and performance, and then technical proficiency. So I start doing some more and more digging. And then I get into my Russian books, and it starts saying the minimal amount to get better is between 35 and 40%. So now I know how much I need to use. So if I do this, then I need to use that. Then I called Flex Wheeler, which was my friend, and he was one of the best bodybuilders of all time. And I said, hey, Flex, I need a little bit more muscle mass. What do you feel like is your best rep range to do that? He goes, I never got any bigger than doing stuff for 20 and 25 reps. And I'm like, okay, so there's the rep range. I knew Alexiev had the 15-minute mark. You know, so I started putting all these pieces together, designed the first winning warm-up. 8 months later, I benched 606, like, pow, after squatting the all-time world record. So then what I learned as a powerlifter, which no other powerlifter ever learns, is that you're not fit enough to get stronger. Mm-hmm. You're not conditioned enough for your body to allow you to put on muscle. So the next year I apply it. I squat 870 in a belt, take the world record from 832 to 870, bench 611 like an empty bar, barely miss 633, and then the pole is right there, break the record again. And I didn't change anything in my training other than adding in those warm-ups. And like we talked about, I'm talking 30-pound dumbbells to bench press 611. Yeah. Everybody that messages me about winning warm-ups, hey, Matt, that winning warm-up's really kicking my butt. I don't know what's wrong. Yeah. Well, how much do you bench? Well, around 250. Yeah. What dumbbells are you using? We're around 50 pounds. What? You know? And that, again, don't take something off the internet and copy it without knowing what you're doing. Yeah. The trick is you want to get the muscles, the ligaments, and the tendons prepared for the main lift, not destroyed.
And that's what speaks to me as a man who's in his 40s that wants longevity, that wants to keep staying healthy. My goal is not to hit an all-time world record. My goal is to pick up my grandkids. Yeah. So it speaks to me on that level, too, in terms of mileage and longevity, the winning warm-ups.
Well, if you think about this, okay, guys, nerve tissue, muscle, and bone, because it constantly recycles itself, adapts to training very fast. Ligaments, tendons, and cartilage do not. So the same loading is going to take, let's say you do 8 weeks of really hard training cycle, right? 8-10 weeks. It's going to take 60 weeks for the ligaments and tendons to catch up. So that's why you build in deloads. Because the deloads, you might feel, oh, I feel strong, I still want to keep going. It's not about how you feel, it's about the tissues that will fail. You start tearing cartilage or tearing tendons, it doesn't matter how strong the muscle is, right? So you have to be very cautious of that and make sure that you have catch-up phases where the rest of those tissues can catch up.
When you were on Dave Tate's Table Talk, you said something that just stuck in my mind that came back to me right now. Skeletal mileage is permanent.
Skeletal mileage is permanent.
And that resonated with me. I thought, yeah, I mean.
So all the exercises that you do, you have to have a risk to benefit ratio. You might like to do, again, you message those log presses,
Oh, yeah.
You just announced for those log presses. That'd be one of the last exercises I would ever do.
Yeah.
Because show me somebody doing that does that at a high level at 55. They don't. Why? Because they don't have any shoulders left. So I'm not a big fan of the military press if you just want to be generally strong everywhere. I mean, Kong, how many times do you use militaries in a given month? Not that many, right? A little bit. He bench presses 225 for 80 plus reps and doesn't use militaries. And his shoulders look like boulders. I mean,
Yeah.
So if you're doing it for aesthetics, you might want to find a less mileage way, is my point, right? So everything has to have a risk to benefit ratio when you're training, or you're just creating more problems than you are advancements. Because, let's say you get your muscle super strong, but you hurt your joint. And then you got to do a 2-week bed rest, in theory, to let it heal. You just lost 50% of that muscle gain, like that, just laying around for 2 weeks. You know how I know it's 2 weeks? Because I watched astronauts go up into outer space, come back, and they were 40% weaker in 14 days because gravity is no longer pushing on you. That's how fast muscles adapt or maladapt to training, right? But ligaments, tendons, and cartilage, once they adapt to training, they're almost permanent.
Well, I mean, Matt, I have 3 more pages of stuff I want to ask you, but
Well, pick the cool ones you want.
Well, I'm getting the signal from Jake that there's a good amount of people downstairs waiting to meet you.
Oh, okay.
So I don't want to hog you because I'm not sitting in my basement having this computer talk with you like I normally do.
Why are they in the
This is
basement? If they're
HomeGymCon.
not in here, that's what I don't.
Yeah, exactly. So they should probably be up here.
Yeah.
So yeah, at HomeGymCon, there's some people downstairs in the hall that want to meet you, and there's a meet and greet with you scheduled that we got to kind of stick to. I'm not, joking when I say this. I'm going to save my notes. I want to have you on again in the future if you'd be gracious with your time. I do appreciate your time.
Not a problem.
But where can people find you? And, WenningStrength.com for sure. We mentioned your YouTube.
Yeah, Winning Strength YouTube. I mean, I've got almost 400 videos on there.
Yeah.
Not including the shorts that are very high quality.
Yeah.
So go on there, and if you do, please comment and try to share them as much as you can. YouTube's very particular about algorithms, so don't just go watch it. Like, literally activate yourself into the channel because it helps with everything.
It does.
Obviously I post a lot of my different exercises on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to see some of the training system and philosophies that we use, hop on my Patreon. I post all my workouts that I do personally right there. And we've also converted a lot of that stuff over to Train Heroic for the fire departments. So if you're looking for a lower mileage way to get stronger in a little bit more of an athletic sense, the tactical Train Heroic would be an amazing thing. We have Queens, New York Fire Department on it. We got Sydney SWAT teams on it. We got some SEAL team guys on it. So it fits the bill. But those things are probably your best bets as far as finding that. And then if you just go on Google and just my name, you're going to find 100 podcasts with the same information that you can figure out and use it. But sometimes you have to absorb it multiple times to really utilize it. So anything you learn from this, go and apply it so it sticks. That's the biggest problem is you can listen all you want, but until you actually utilize it, you're not going to feel what I'm saying. You're only going to try to understand it.
Makes sense to me.
Yep.
I can't thank you enough.
No problem.
Appreciate it.
Yep.
Nice meeting you. You can find me on YouTube as Vintage Weights PGH. And of course, please like, subscribe, and follow Garage Gym Radio so you don't miss any home gym history podcasts. Here at HomeGymCon 2023, the very first one. If you're sitting at home watching this, I encourage you, get on your calendar and put in HomeGymCon 2024. Start saving your money and come on out here because we're having a good time. Everybody that was up here for this podcast, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming up here. Thanks, Matt.